I'm Christiaan Knaap, I'm from FHIR. I build a FHIR server for work, so and that leads to some questions sometimes. So that's why I try to set up this session. Hopefully you can answer some of these questions. It will be less technical than the previous one. I saw a join on the view screen. I like joins, but I won't talk about them right now. I will talk about FHIR servers, and not just my own, by the way. What's the question? Because we sell a FHIR server, people want to know, well, yeah, I've heard I have to do FHIR, and I think I need a FHIR server, but where should it be? What should I do with it? Where should it go in my organization, or in between my systems, or on top, below, or I don't know. So that's actually the question I'm trying to answer today from various perspectives. Probably not all. So if you have questions from your own experience or whatever, feel free to interrupt. The only limitation is the 40-minute session time. Well, what is a FHIR server? Let's start with the food server. It serves food, and you care about some things, and you don't care about other things. So you care about what do they serve, and will it fit your plate? But how it gets to you, well, you don't really care. So a FHIR server does the same, but it serves FHIR. That's basically the thing. And Rolf yesterday was kind enough to introduce the T-shaped model, T-shaped person. So FHIR servers give you the choice. Well, FHIR API gives you the choice to focus either on, do I buy an implementation of this API and just use it, or do I want to implement this? And then how do I do that? Do you care about what can it do? A FHIR server expresses that with its capability statement. Did I lose someone already? No. And you care about, does it spit out valid resources, or does it accept valid resources so my data does not get polluted? How old is the data that I get? And in what format is sometimes important, because in a mobile app, sometimes JSON is easier than XML, or maybe you want RDF for reasoning on it. There can be various aspects that you do or do not care about, not necessarily in this order. Well, a FHIR server is actually a bit strange in specification because there's not so much about it. I searched for it. This is on the http.html page. It's kind of my homepage because it describes what a FHIR server should be able to do, but actually it's not on the page that it should do this. So these are all tiny, it's a tiny font because you don't need to read all of it. But for instance, it says, when processing create and update interaction, a FHIR server is not obliged to accept the entire resource as it is. Well, that's interesting to know, but it doesn't tell me what a FHIR server should all do, except that it should honor this. They do not have to support versioning, although they are strongly encouraged to do so. Well, okay, so we support versioning, but we don't have, but what do they have to do then? Luckily, on the overview architecture, it's a very interesting page, but I don't know how many of you have actually seen it. It says a FHIR server is any software that implements the FHIR APIs. On that part, I was even a bit confused because I thought it implemented FHIR RESTful API. And it used FHIR resources to exchange data. So for this presentation, we are going to focus on that RESTful API. And it can be any software implementing that. Parts of it, or all of it. I don't think there's any FHIR server implementing all of it, although Graham comes close. And these are the interactions listed on that famous HTTP page. Anyone never seen this page? Yeah, I see one that's very daring to admit. But I know the guy. Well, it tells just the interactions you can do on the URL. There's generic FHIR servers, and they support, well, most of the RESTful API. As I said, I don't think there's any FHIR server that does all of it. It does it for all the types of resources, and frankly, most generic FHIR servers do not really care what resource you put in there. And they have some storage of their own to store those resources, which is interesting in its own because FHIR originated as a standard for exchanging data. It doesn't tell you anything about storing data. But right now, you see people requesting FHIR servers as a backend storage. Store native FHIR data, well, whatever that may be. Because still, every generic FHIR server chooses its own storage. And it might also depend on the type of database that's behind it. Then there are specific FHIR servers. This is a distinction I make. It's not from the spec. It implements only some parts of the API, and it's often bound to a specific backend system. For example, an EHR or a laboratory system that will serve specific resources. Not all of them. And you could see that as a FHIR facade to a certain system. So you can now speak FHIR to a system that already existed. That's the idea. It might have domain-specific operations. So if you have an appointment scheduling system, or then you may be able to get appointment slots. If a terminology server might do the value set expansion. A bit background on what happened to my mic. It's gone. Interesting. Yeah, it's gone. Well, I think I can do without, but someone will be reporting that it's gone. If you're integrating systems, this is a must-read book. I read it a long time ago. And it makes you don't need to know all the patterns, but it makes you think in a more structured way about integration. It's a lot about messaging, a bit less about REST, but a lot of the patterns apply. So I chose in the rest of the presentation to use some of those patterns just for reference. If you don't get them or don't know them, that's not a problem for understanding the rest of the presentation. But if you're involved in architecture of integration, I would highly recommend it. We'll start simple. We have a single consumer. It may be an app, it may be another hospital system, it may be someone in the area needing your data. And we have a single source of data. So, and these are the patterns that apply. You need a channel that you must be able to consume data from this channel. So you need to speak, for instance, HTTP, or you may be the MLLP. Who knows that still? Yeah, it's a lower level protocol, but it just happened. It's a polling consumer. It will just ask for the data when it needs it. And you need a message mapper. So if you get data in, you will need to understand that. We have a single source of data, and it also needs a message endpoint. In the FHIR world, that's your REST endpoint that you can talk to. You can do this without FHIR. You just ask for the data here, and you translate it here to what you need. But for simplicity's case, we start here with FHIR. You can do it three ways. You can put a facade on the source. You can make the source called FHIR. That's better. How did I run out of a battery in like 15 minutes? So, you can make the source talk FHIR. You could put a FHIR server in the middle, or you could put one on the consumer end. I'll talk to each of them. And if you put it on the source, you have to read that data still natively from the source with the facade programming. And there's two things you have to map. One is the incoming call. For instance, a FHIR search is pretty complicated. Could be pretty complicated. If you have change search parameters and includes and whatnot, it might be difficult to map that, but somehow it has to translate into something the source can answer. That's often a SQL query, but it might also be another web API call or a map reduce statement. Then when the data comes back, you have to map that to FHIR resources. Well, this way the source becomes a FHIR server, supporting read and search in this case, because we have a read-only interface in our example. And there are systems that are doing that. For instance, the larger EHR, like Cerner and Epic, are doing this on a large scale. And yesterday I saw the one by Cerner. I was quite impressed with what they're doing. But you can also do it on a small scale. You can put the generic FHIR server in the middle. That means you pre-aggregate that data in that FHIR server, because the source now has to push it to the server for the customer to be able to, or the consumer to be able to get it there. That also results in a copy of the data. That's an important issue. You may not want that. And you also have to decide where that copy will reside. Is it on-premise or is it in the cloud? Do you want that? You have to map the data outbound here in the source, but you don't have to map that, that FHIR REST interface. That's the easier part. You just have to schedule pushing out that data as FHIR resources to the server. So you can do that either scheduled or event-driven or somehow, but it does mean that the FHIR server, the data in the FHIR server, is a little behind the source. Could be long, could be short. The advantage is you can also defer the load to the FHIR server instead of getting it on your source system, which may be busy enough, or a small system not intended to query largely. And well, the FHIR server you can just buy or download, or there's several options for that. And with all the associated features that come with it. So you don't have to implement all those search features or a safe create, whatever. Effectively, you have a FHIR client now on both sides. One issuing posts or puts, and the one issuing gets. Then you can put the facade on the consumer side. It's no longer a polling consumer now, because it has a REST interface, and REST interfaces don't ask for data. So now you get to push it from the source to the consumer. Now you have to map the put and the post calls. And the data, both. Now put and post may be simpler. As soon as you go to conditional creates and updates, it becomes difficult again. And you have to be aware of transactional integrity and such. So implementing this facade is not that easy either. But you can do it. And now the consumer becomes a FHIR server. So we have 3 places to put a FHIR server, and it depends on where you place it, on what you have to implement, and you get a lot of other choices. Where is the data, how old is it, etc. Also in this case, the data on the consumer will be slightly delayed behind the source because it can't ask for it when it needs it. It just hopes it gets it beforehand. So, the funny thing is, it all got just more complicated by using FHIR than instead of these 2 systems talking to each other. So we add a couple of more sources. Now the consumer not only becomes the integration point as well. Which source comes first? Which has priority? It still has the initiative here in this image. It will pull for data when it needs it. And, but it needs a mapping for each source, which is doable for 2, but once that starts growing. It also has to be able to communicate on each channel, because these 2 channels might not be the same. They might have different protocols. And it needs mappings for each source, and it may need to ask all the sources for information if it doesn't know which source carries which information, or maybe information is duplicated from both sources and it has to have the latest one. And it also has to combine all those responses into one set of data to actually use. We can apply the same patterns here. We can put the facades on the source. Now it becomes a little easier for the consumer, because it's still the integration point. It still gets data from multiple sources. It's for the consumer, but it has only one mapper. It only needs to understand FHIR. That's the advantage. We call this scatter-gather, so it calls out for each of the sources and then gathers all the results. Still has to aggregate those results. Still possible that something from one FHIR server is newer than the other, etc. But at least you have a stable format, and you can just inspect the last updated, for example, because that's the same in each and every resource. Now the sources become the FHIR servers, and they have to do mapping of the REST interface and the data just as in the previous case. But now you have to do it twice. Again, you can put a generic FHIR in the middle. Now we have 3 mappings to FHIR, 2 from the sources and 1 from the consumer. The ones in the sources were a bit hidden in the facade net, but they were there. But you have the advantage that you don't need to implement the REST interface. The same things apply. The data gets a little delayed. You get a copy of the data, but the integration moves to the FHIR server. A standard FHIR server that you don't do anything about usually will not know how to handle that. It will just accept the latest put as truth. If that is not the case, then you still have to implement some logic to make sure that the actual source of truth wins. For instance, maybe this is the EHR containing the patient index, and this is the laboratory system, and it sends the patients along with its observations. You should just ignore them, or configure this one to not send their patients. For the consumer, it becomes easier now. It just has one endpoint to talk to, and it just needs to understand FHIR. Well, last is put the facade on the consumer. It's for consistency of all the slides, but I would not really recommend it, because you just combine all the complexities. You still have to build a facade on the consumer, but it still has to find out which wins. It has to just needs to understand FHIR. That's the advantage. And it can't pull anymore. It depends on pushing the data by the sources. Then you can get it even more complicated by combining this. You can put a generic FHIR server in the middle that then defers all the calls to the facades on the source. So if you already have a facade, for example, if you use an EHR that gives you a FHIR interface, you just relay the call to there. But you will need additional logic in your generic FHIR server in the middle to do that. In effect, your general FHIR server in the middle now becomes a facade for the rest. That's the way of seeing it. And the FHIR server becomes a message router. So these are some of the other patterns then that move to the FHIR server. And it needs no storage. So your data is live. Or no more delayed than the web call, at least. The consumer can still be a client. Well, I think you're getting the point. If you have integrated systems, then this is a familiar image. You add more sources, you add more targets, and then if you do a little math, that is, assume there's more than 2 on this side and 2 on that side, you have a problem. Then it becomes more efficient to do a mapping to a single canonical data model, which is what this acronym is for, and it's one of the patterns of the book, a canonical data model, and FHIR provides that. So it becomes useful to encapsulate those mappings close to the source. And that's something I would like to give you as a giveaway. Put those mappings near the source. That's easier for maintenance. Once the source changes, you just have to change the mapping there and not everywhere else. It could be logically near or physically near, but it's better to put them near the sources. One other thing is not all systems can run a facade. In some of the images I said, make the consumer a facade. If the consumer is a mobile app, that's, well, not really feasible. Although your phone can probably run a FHIR server, it won't not always be available. Another question sometimes asked is, do I actually need FHIR for this, and do I need a FHIR server for it? Not always. Can I use just a common integration engine? For instance, it can do the scheduling for you to fill a FHIR server, or to push that data to another consumer, which then, and you have to choose whether you either use FHIR as the canonical data model or another bundle. But being on this conference, you're probably inclined to use FHIR as the data model. So then you need to implement that model on this integration server to do that. Often these integration engines provide a lot of tooling to do the mapping from and to other data sources, and that is very helpful. I don't know any generic FHIR server that can already do that. And it could provide a custom endpoint instead of a FHIR REST endpoint. So, for instance, if you agree that I just need a bundle of these resources every week on this endpoint, I don't care for the rest of the FHIR RESTful interface. I don't want to publish a capability statement. Well, you can do that. I know of a party that actually does that. But it's probably a better fit for a message broker solution, as we know it from the HL7 version 2 world. Because the integration engine are usually targeted to routing messages along and not storing the data for themselves to be able to host it on a RESTful interface later. But if you're into messaging, this might be the better solution. So these are some of the considerations that we have come across. Do you allow incoming requests? If you don't, you can't host a FHIR server. So you have to push it somewhere out to another FHIR server. Do you allow copies of the data, and do you allow them to be on-premise or off-premise or in the cloud or wherever? Do you control all the participants in the communication? Because if you do, you have a lot more choices on where to put a facade or where to put data or control the delay of communication. If you don't, you can make a much more robust system by providing FHIR RESTful interfaces along the way and building them on top of each other. Who has the initiative? Can someone pull the data, or should you push it? Or so that's where the initiative is. Who's the primary source of truth? If you have patient information scattered around, and you usually do because the V2 engine scatters it around, then who's the source of truth and who should not send that data? And maybe also important, what are the development capabilities of your team? If you decide to build a facade, be it in Delphi, Java, .NET, or JavaScript, you need the resources to do so. I don't know, Cerner and Epic do have those resources, but maybe your organization does or does not. Or maybe you can use some prefabricated components to do so, and you have to match them up to the language that someone can understand. So, the final slide contains the answer. And it's always the same answer in our business, isn't it? But I tried to explain what it kind of depends on. I think I'm pretty much ahead. There's no clock in my view. 5 to 12. So I have plenty of time for questions. Would someone like to share his own architecture in which you have these kind of questions? Or is there a pattern that I didn't cover at all? I can imagine I covered everything. Do you just don't want to speak up? So if you don't, and you can do that later, by the way, here's my email address. Then we just have a short session, which is good as well. I like to be concise. And you can come to me afterwards as well. We'll have it. Humbling. Yeah.
Is there any particular implementation that you have seen is not working with it? Like, go with this kind of database because sooner or later you're going to run into it. In our business, everything is possible. It doesn't matter the time and money. But often you get to the end of something you figure out, I should have gone left a long time ago and just gone right. Are you any experience so far what not to do? What not to do?
Yeah. The question is, do you have any experience of where a choice was made that was regretted later, although at the beginning all choices seemed equal? Is that the question? And then along the way, I'm afraid I haven't. And if you mentioned, for instance, the database technology, and on a facade you're stuck with the technology of the existing system. And if that is very hard to query, or it is not properly indexed for the queries that you want to do, you might regret that. And maybe you could move better to a generic FHIR server. As for the generic servers, they are available on different databases. I know of Nikolai who does it on PostgreSQL, and I know Graham does MySQL. We do SQL Server and Mongo, so you have just about any choice, and they all work. So for the FHIR storage, it doesn't really matter as long as you have a proper model to store it. I'm not aware of large regrets yet. I happen to know his name, Otto in the back, and then you. Yeah.
One consideration I didn't see on the sheet was identity and access control.
Yeah.
And what's your opinion on that?
I think that the FHIR server should be able to understand authorization and needs to be able to identify you. I think a FHIR server in itself is not an authorization server, so it needs to get the identities provided and the scopes that you're allowed to see. You should be able to understand that. That might complicate your facade in your facades. If you have to implement that or understand that on your FHIR server that you implement on your system. Generic FHIR servers are picking this up already. Some are further than others. For one, we still have to implement it, and so it depends. If you put a lot of facades on it, you distribute the problem as well, and that might be a consideration that you might not want to do that. On the other hand, you can tie it then to the data in the database, which might have already knowledge about that, what you want to filter on, what you want to authorize on. Does that answer your question in any way?
For now.
All right. I see Graham, but the person here in the middle was first. Yes.
So, like you have mentioned about the mapping, right?
Right.
You have mentioned about the mapping, like when you are like talking to a FHIR server, you have to implement mapping.
Yeah.
So my question is like how people do mapping. Let's say I have a system, okay, and there are two fields. Like let's say in US we have race, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I mean race is you have when you create a patient record, so you have to fill the race also for that particular patient.
Yeah.
But race is not part of standard file.
Yeah.
So let's say I have a server which accepts race as input, but then there are lines, okay, and they use standard file.
Yeah.
So how we will do that part? Like,
How do you do mapping if data that you need is not provided? Is that the short version of the question? Well, you don't. You cannot map data that's not there. And that is what profiles are invented for. If you need, as your example, the rates, which is very common in the US and it's forbidden in Europe, then you need to publish in your capability statement that you, for patients, you want them on probably the US profile, or the Argonaut profile, or the US core profile it's called, I think. So you're sure, and you can validate for that. So you're sure that everything is coming in that actually contains that recent information, and if it's not, you turn it down. You don't accept it. But you can't invent that data in the mapping.
And for mapping, like you have some rule and like we have write custom code. How do we do this mapping? We have write on custom code, or like there is some rule or something?
You mean you have to translate maybe the value set or code system. If you get in, FHIR defines the code, and it defines whether the binding is whether it's you're allowed to deviate from it. So if you have another coding in your own system, then yeah, you will have to translate the code. There's nothing you can do about it. But that's part of that translation you have to do in that facade or in the translation of the data that you send to a FHIR server. Yeah. Great.
I was just going to point out that the generic FHIR servers are really, really useful tools, but they don't have a limitlessly configurable access control engine. And so they're not really off the shelf, because you'll have to hack them or modify them in code, mostly, one way or another, to use them in production to get your access control the way you want it to be.
Yeah, that is true. And what you see, and Graham pointed out, for those who didn't hear it here in the front, that even though I mentioned that FHIR servers can be bought or downloaded off the shelf or off GitHub, that you often have to tweak them, and often in code, to make them accept your ways of authorization. That's true, and you can do that in, for instance, the Happy server. You can do that in Vonk by adding components to it. I guess that over time, FHIR servers will be more configurable in this space. They will never ever cover every case. And if they don't, make sure they are extendable in code.
I didn't understand why in your example of having a server in the middle, putting facades on the servers made the server in the middle not need to persist data.
Because then I go back to the slide you mentioned. This one?
Yeah.
If this receives a request from the consumer, it might not consider the database as its backend, but yeah, I have 5 minutes. But consider other FHIR servers as its backend. So it will not. So essentially, this is not now a generic FHIR server anymore. There's no storage below it. It becomes a facade to those source systems. And this is something that it doesn't exist yet off the shelf.
But
I know for that.
It's kind of a federation.
Yeah, it's a federation setup.
The only thing that this server knows is where to search, depending on your search.
Where to search or
if
depend.
this is one region and this another region, he will know how to and when to ask any of those. But only those.
Yeah, and the advantage is that the consumer has only one address and it can talk FHIR. The downside is that you have to build this like a sort of facade onto these other FHIR interfaces. Does that answer your question? I know.
Doesn't that complicate your authorization? Because in a sense, who is actually talking to the source now? That server in the middle. How do you identify them? Who is the actual consumer behind?
Yes, well there you come to the question, do you control your environment? If all these FHIR servers, both the facades and the central server, can access the same identity server, providing the identity in the authorization tokens, then you can control it, then you can do this. It's like federated authorization.
Yeah, but
But
it's actually a scenario because in some cases you will actually want to be the server, in other cases you will be acting on behalf of the consumer. So I don't think you have really one scenario that runs for all.
I didn't get the part on where you want to be server sometime and act on the consumer another time.
Well, I guess for some queries you will say, okay, now I act as a server, but consider this as a data source for you, and I'm the server querying the data source. In other scenarios you will say, no, here I'm really querying on behalf of the consumer, a specific one. I don't know if you can really say there will be only one. You will always either transitively pass on the authorization of the consumer, or sometimes you will act on your own. I think you will have both cases.
Yeah, that is true. In that case, the central server needs an identity of its own. Yeah, and probably a server certificate. What you do point out, by the way, is that, and I could emphasize that, it's useful to, if you have a system that could also query data, but also provide data to others, so it's sometimes a consumer, sometimes a server, then to separate those roles logically. It may be a FHIR client, it may be a FHIR server at the same time, but those are different responsibilities. Think final question.
Tell me about FHIR messaging.
Hmm?
So for FHIR RESTful APIs, because the messaging process, FHIR messaging, that's where the integration mechanism.
Yeah. I talked about it briefly when I said you might also want to use a, where is it? There, I think. A normal common integration engine to send those messages back and forth, because in the messaging paradigm, the sender and the receiver have to understand what it's about, but there's nothing in the middle that should actually understand it, I think. Just maybe the header information to send it along to the right receiver. So you don't have to actually store that data somewhere. And you also don't usually have a polling consumer. You have this, the initiative is usually at the source of the data that says, and I have something and I'll send it around. Or you have a messaging system with a request and response, which then starts to look like a web request and response, but then asynchronous. But no, I didn't go into very much detail, as I don't hear anyone asking for the messaging paradigm anymore. Well, we did have a customer that did that in a consultancy question, and it took about 10 minutes to get them to rest. So thank you for your attention, and I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the day.